fix this just a little bit better so you can. And here, let's see if we can get this down just a wee bit. There we go. Okay. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Wow, getting late. Yes, today's the 21st of April, 2021, and hello, everyone, as you come in. I'm Roy Potter, of course, and I've had a few questions from people, not necessarily here, but some others. And so I thought that I would come on and explain something that you might find very, very interesting if you don't already know. Biblical scholars will know exactly what I'm talking about. Uh, so, who here has heard about Q? Who knows about Q? I'm baiting you. Okay, you know about Q? Everybody knows it. Thanks. I'm 5 by 5. Thank you, RJ Diamond. Okay. Good evening. Hey, Ms. Cat. No, I always appreciate when you're here. Okay. Yeah, I knew that would that would get people's attention having a video called the Q document. But in fact, I'm not talking about the Q phenomenon that started back in 2017 under Trump and continues on till today. I'm not talking about that at all. So before I get there, before we actually talk about the Q document, you'll see why I'm bringing this up. We're also going to get back into Paul for just a few minutes and the Dead Sea Scrolls and the resurrection, believe it or not. Okay, so let's start off here. Notice I finally figured out that you guys, I'm seeing it in reverse, so this is the side it should be on so you could see it. Then that way the chat can cover me up. You remember I did this the other day with this decision matrix that I have used, and this isn't the only tool, as I mentioned, that you use in historical method. This is one of my. It's very similar to what's done, but this is my version of it, and that's what I was telling you about the other day because I carried it over from the military. You remember we compared the four gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and the exercise was to determine, what may be accurate in the long run about what really happened historically. And I was talking about using this in place of the historians. We could have put Josephus up here. We could have put Hegesippus. We could have put Origen. We could have put just a bunch of people. And that would be more fitting, but I wanted you to see how it worked with something that you were familiar with. So we used a couple, actually three delineators. We used crucifixion, we used the whipping in the temple, and we used the turning water into wine. And you remember, we know that the crucifixion was mentioned in all four. We know that the whipping was mentioned in all four. But the wine was only mentioned in John. So, where does this lead us? Uh, One of the questions I got, it was kind of a roundabout question. Somebody asked me if I'm saying that the Catholic Church wrote the Gospels and then put them in there. No, I'm not saying that. As a matter of fact, the Catholic Church didn't show up as a real organization until several centuries later. Well, at least a century and a half later. You start getting some things under Irenaeus and Origen and people like that. But no, the Catholic Church didn't write the Gospels. There's a thing called the Q document. And biblical scholars have recognized this for some time. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the synoptic gospels. That means they're very similar. They look at things very similarly. They're almost clones of each other. John is the outlier. And there are possible reasons for this. I'm not going to get into that today. But what I do want to do is tell you that there is evidence here in Matthew, Mark, and Luke that there was a source document that they all drew from. Uh, there were no apostles named Mark and Luke. You all know that, right? There was an apostle named Matthew, but even this one, and this is going to disappoint some people, but this is probably not the actual apostle that's writing this. He could have been the author of the original Q document, the source document that this was taken all from. But at any rate, Mark and Luke are not apostles. Matthew may or may not be, depending upon the, because a lot of people were using pseudos back then, pseudepigrapha, pretending to be somebody else. And that was legitimate in those days. I mean, that happened a lot. So it's not like they were committing a fraud. It's kind of the way things worked. So at any rate, there was apparently this source document. And the reason why I decided to bring this up as well is not because of just the question on whether the Catholics actually wrote the Gospels, but also because there, when you look at the Q document, and you can tell that these other Gospels are from this source document from Q, you know that they're taking it from something, and that's something we've never found. Okay, we've never found that source document. One of the accusations that are made with that is, well, if the Dead Sea Scrolls were in the first century, why haven't we found any of the New Testament scriptures? Well, primarily because they weren't written, they weren't even starting to be written by and large until Mark. The Gospel of Mark wasn't written until around 60 AD, around the time James was killed. And most of the others, as far back as we can go, were not actually published until around the turn of the first century to the second century. So the question is, why weren't any of these source documents found in the Dead Sea Scroll area that would back up what I've been saying about the Dead Sea Scrolls? You would think that these people would have written something. Well, they did. And a lot of the things that are in the Damascus document and the War Scroll and even the MMT documents substantiate a lot of that activity, but it's not plain enough for most people. Well, what I suspect is that this Q source document, which is at this point just a theory by biblical scholars, that it's the source material for these things, because these were not eyewitnesses, not that late in the game. Mark possibly, but probably not. These are pseudepigrapha documents. I hate to disappoint people, but they are taken from an original document that we have yet to find. And I suspect, now, the Qumran caves where they found most of the Dead Sea Scrolls, they've really only processed like 2 caves. That's really about it. But these people back then probably planted a lot of these caves with documents. Okay, this late in the game, when we're talking about 30 to 40 AD, 50 AD, 60 AD, they were definitely still in the process of writing, so they weren't really that concerned, I don't think, with hiding things. But that these New Testament, these documents that will be more New Testament like are yet to be found. But it's going to be this Q document. That's what we're going to find. We're going to find, if it's available, if it hasn't been destroyed, at some point during these excavations. And Robert Eisenman again was very much involved in these excavations at Qumran. They will find this document eventually, if it exists and if it hasn't been destroyed. And there will probably be several like it. This Q document that was used for Matthew, Mark, and Luke is obviously talking about the life of Jesus in itself, not just James, or the Moreh HaTzedek, for instance, that a lot of the other Dead Sea Scrolls are. These will talk about the life of Jesus in particular. So we're anxious to find that, but so far it's eluded the archaeologists and the scholars. But I think that eventually, at some point in time, if the New World Order doesn't destroy us in the process, in the meantime, we'll get that. Now, it's also possible that somebody's already got it and they're hiding it, just like they hid the original Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, why would they do that? Well, because then, you see, if they find this Q source document in the same area that the Dead Sea Scrolls came from, that will give more credence to the not just the theory, but all of the evidence that suggests that a lot of these Dead Sea Scrolls were written during the time of Jesus and, of course, James. That would just solidify it. So they're not real anxious to find this Q document, this original source document for the synoptics, because of that reason. So they could have already found it, and they're just keeping it from us, like they kept the Dead Sea Scrolls from us for so long, because they didn't want the evidence showing that this stuff was going on in the first century against the Herodians and the Romans. And we're going to talk about a little about that in just a minute. Yeah, I'm not going to talk about. I know there's a lot of news going on, but like I said, we know where we are, on this stuff. So I'm just kind of not going there for a little while right now. I hope you all understand. So at any rate, yeah, the Q document. Look it up. I'm sure there's something on the internet about it, on the web, to give you a little more information about it. And like I said, uh, what may have occurred here is that by that time, the other day, you might remember I said that I think that maybe Josephus and Paul had a hand in writing the Gospels. And that's almost like saying the Catholic Church wrote them, but it's not the same thing. Um, it would have been, if they had this source document. Let's just say that Jesus himself, or James the brother, or one of the other wrote down these events that were going on in the Gospels, that the Gospels drew on. Let's say that they wrote it down, and then it fell into the hands of Paul, and he would have had access because he joined this group for some time, right? He actually joined it, pretended to be a friend, but wasn't. He was a turncoat, just like Josephus. In reality, that's what he was. And I've already talked about that. I'm not going to go too far into it, other than to say that they could have gotten a hold of this Q document by Paul and then written it so that they changed it subtly. The synoptic gospels changed them subtly to push this pacifist Christ persona, this character that was very pacifist in nature, because historically that would not have been the case, as I've already explained. No, Josephus wasn't Paul. No. We know, despite the arguments I've had with people on it, we're almost 100% sure that the Paul of the New Testament is actually Saulus, brother of Costobarus. And I know that they're trying to say the dates are off and all that stuff. Hey, if you read my introduction to my book, I show you where the dates are off, even in the New Testament testimony, because they talk about the tax of Cyrenius and the death of Herod, and there's a 10-year difference mentioned right there in the gospel. So, and that's another thing that people make a mistake on. When you go through high school, even college, and you're not taking history at a really high level. Dates are a big thing with a lot of teachers. When I was in high school, one of my favorite courses was history, and dates were an issue, but what was more important were the events. And my history teacher, Mr. Walsh was his name. What a guy! He actually made history exciting. He'd get up there and he'd talk about like the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and he'd kind of act it out in the class. Really, really interesting. I think he's the one that really whet my appetite for history. So, at any rate, I think that we're going to see at some point in time, if these investigations are permitted to go, this Q document. So I'll just leave that at that. I just wanted to show you this again and explain that that's probably where they came from. Okay, it doesn't mean that John isn't legitimate. All right, and it doesn't mean that the wine thing didn't happen in the synoptics. All right, it's just something that you have to be aware of. Okay, so all right. I just wanted to hit on that real quick and let you know in case you didn't know about that. Let's go ahead and talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls real quick, because I think this is important too. I've explained this many times, and if any of you were watching Twitter, there were some people there that were really upset. They wanted to argue with me. They wanted to debate me, and I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to do doctoral dissertations on Twitter. I'm not going to do doctrinal defenses. Nothing like that. Okay, doctoral defenses. Not going to do that, because it's just too time consuming. It doesn't really solve anything. All it usually is a way to be obstinate, and confrontational, which is what it turned out to be anyway. If you saw any of those posts, He started attacking my personal character and things like that. Too bad. But let's talk about some of the issues about the Dead Sea Scrolls that I think, again, you need to understand. The arguments have been that to try to put the Dead Sea Scrolls entirely in the first and second centuries BC, in other words, before Jesus, okay? And Eisenman's and some other scholars, including like James Tabor from the University of North Carolina, who backed the James ossuary when that came out about 20 years ago, that was for real. It turned out it wasn't, but and if you don't know about that, that's an interesting thing. Eisenman called it a fake right off the bat, but at any rate, I still like James Tabor a lot. He's a really good scholar by and large. Dr. Altman from Jerusalem University, Dr. David Price from Loyola, and there are others who put these things, at least a number of them, in the first century. But they don't. But the vast majority have not wanted to put them in the first century. Again, as I said, because it would show that these were not the pacifist Christians that we've been led to believe, because they weren't even known as Christians until Antioch, and that was after Paul. So during Paul. So and that was actually his invention. Actually, before that, as I've said, they were called Messianists. They were called Sicarii by the Romans. They may have called themselves the Way. That was another. Jesus talked about being in the way. Narrow is the wide is the gate, and narrow is the way. Right. The Way was what they would have been calling themselves, one of their names, amongst some others like the poor and the meek and all that. But at any rate, so I'm going to say again, what were some of the things that actually delineated the Dead Sea Scrolls from being entirely in the Maccabean period, but actually proved that a lot of them, were in the Herodian period. And I'm going to say this one more time. People think I'm still skating around that, and I'm not. First of all, during the Maccabean period, the Seleucids were already defeated. There were no Katim in Judea, Katim being invaders. The Greeks had been defeated, the Seleucid Greeks. All right, they moved on up into Syria, and the Ptolemies were in Egypt. Okay, so there were no Katim during the Maccabean reign. That wasn't an issue, and yet the Dead Sea Scrolls are talking about fighting the Katim. Okay, so what are they talking about? Well, again, that only fits the Herodian period when the Herods took over under Rome's control. So Romans were the Katim, not that were there during the Herodian reign, which was illegitimate, as most of you should know by now, was illegitimate. That there were no Katim during the Maccabees. Okay, that's one thing. Another thing that's important to know. There was no problem with the Maccabees, as I mentioned the other day, with fornication, meaning marrying strange wives or incest, particularly niece marriage. They didn't involve themselves in that. That, again, was a Herodian thing. Both the people that were sitting in the positions of power, like the kingship, or the high priesthood, when those Herodians were involved in that kind of incest and niece marriage, and frankly, marrying and divorcing as a matter of course, so that they throw these women away. They'd use them for a while and throw them away, and that's why Jesus said that divorce, was so bad, because of the way the Herodians were doing it. Again, that didn't happen in the Maccabean period. Not a problem, not a case. Okay, another thing: eating of blood or things sacrificed to idols. Again, not a problem in the Maccabean period. It was a problem in the Herodian Roman occupation period. Same thing. We can also go to the eating of things strangled. That means carrion. They find a dead. You've heard about finding the dead rabbit on the road. Throw it in a pot. Well, you don't do that. Okay, you don't do that. And that was another thing that they would do that the Maccabees were not involved in. Okay, is eating things that have been strangled. Okay. I guess the last thing, I could probably talk about some others, but the liar situation. Again, historically and even scripturally in the Maccabees, the books of the Maccabees and all that, we don't see any situation there that fits the Dead Sea Scroll definition of a liar, of the spouter of lies. It's just not there. Again, what that goes into, at least this is my position, it's Eisenman's and it's a lot of other people's, and I can put up some links for you to see this. Um, Maybe I should do that if I remember. Not necessarily scholarly works, but the articles draw from scholars, so you might be interested in that. Uh, the only situation that fits the deal with the spouter of lies, the liar, is the confrontation between James and Paul. Okay, Paul being the one that James and the brethren, the Peter, James, John, etc., those people, the apostles, the original apostles, they would call him a liar because of what he did. Okay, again, nothing in the Maccabean period comes even close to that. And a real major problem is the battles with the Catine, the Romans. Okay, how the war scroll was written to fight the Catine, the Romans. Okay, that's really what that was about, because the Roman Empire and the kingdom of this world meant, Jesus said, my kingdom is not of this world. He meant it's not of the Roman Herodian world. It's a world where there's justice and mercy and liberty. See, so it wasn't even talking about otherworldly stuff when he mentioned that. Okay, so I wanted to kind of clear that up. Hopefully, it was of some interest to everybody. We could get into so deep on this stuff, but I'm trying to just keep it, relatively simple, because first of all, we got to put up with this connection and that, but also because inevitably, I, I get so many questions I can't answer them all, so I try to keep it to the point. All right, let's see what else have we got here. Okay. A big question that comes up is why there's no mention of the resurrection in the historical documents. Well, despite what I've said about Paul's epistles, and even though I think that he was at odds with the actual original apostles, if you did those readings that I gave you the other day, you noticed he boasts about being as good as the what does he call it here? I think I've even gotten it down here if I wrote it down. Well, the word is kind of like super apostles, the big guys. And he says, I'm as good as they are. Well, in fact, he wasn't, because they were his brothers and close friends. They were Jesus's brothers and close friends. Paul never met the guy, okay? So he's trying to push his weight around, is basically what he's saying, if you read those situations. And that one where he says, it's in Corinthians, where he says, the chiefest apostles. That's why he says, I'm as good as the chiefest of the apostles. So he's comparing himself even to James. Well, Peter had to answer to James. And Jesus said, in all things, look to James, right? Not in the New Testament. We get that from the Clementines and some other things, which again, if you're trying to push something other than what happened, you have a Q document, but you do have an agenda like, Paul would have had, and certainly like Josephus would have had. You would have written things down differently to confuse the leadership. We do that today all the time. Look at how we overthrow governments and stuff around the world. Okay, so it's the same process. So Peter was subject to James, so there's no way that Paul would not have been as well. But what he did was I've said this ad infinitum now, ad nauseum. He claimed this big vision so he could get inside the organization, and he earned their trust initially. All right, he did all the things that they wanted them to do, right? And then basically they welcomed him into that, and then he turned on them. What's that called when you befriend somebody and you turn on them? It's betrayal. But he did it as a matter of design. And all of his subsequent things with the Herodians and with the Romans proves that point. Okay? Yes, he was very well respected in the diaspora. As a matter of fact, that he and James had the arguments about circumcision and about going out to the Gentiles, because James was saying, "No, well, this is just to our people. It's not we don't concern ourselves with it." And then Paul says, "Well, I think I ought to go out and at least preach it, because there might be some Jews out there that need to hear it." And so James probably said, "Yeah, okay, I can see that." And then Paul started converting Greeks, not Jews, that were in the diaspora. So he didn't really show that he was totally committed to the original apostles. Okay? And because of that position, he was able to start saying things about them, particularly in the diaspora. And the people out there wouldn't know because they're not in Palestine. So he was able to say these things like, "I'm as good as the chiefest of the apostles," right? Barnabas and Peter, you're hypocrites. All those different things that he was doing. He wasn't carrying the message of the way in a manner that James authorized. He twisted it. He turned it around. And it was to cause division in the movement. Now, people say to me, even now, they'll say, "Roy, you're terrible. You're causing division. You're teaching false doctrine." I'm talking about history, but there's some doctrine tied into it. But you notice these people that say, that I'm being divisive. Does that sound like anybody else who doesn't want you to talk about subject matter? When you go onto the MSM talking about this here, if you try to do this with the MSM, they're all going to be speaking off the same sheet of music. Why? Because they have basically what's a Q document from the bosses, the main head. So you're not going to be able to find much difference in the way the MSM delivers the message. So this system doesn't work too well when you're just using the MSM. That's why you have to use other sources, both alternative, overseas, do some of your own intelligence work, things like that. So I lost my train of thought. That's what happens when I when I get off on tangents too much. What was I talking about just before that? Oh well. No, I'm not the best. Not when I lose my. Why does Peter defend Paul in the book of? Yeah, well, because Peter had more. Peter had more honor than Paul did. Okay, Peter, and that's still early on. That's still early on. All right, that's before the war starts. Okay, so Peter is trying to do the brotherly love thing. Okay, that's number one. Number two is, did Peter really write it? Was it added later? We don't have the original documents, so we don't know. And everything at that point was to try to push Paul to the forefront because he was changing the doctrine, basically. He was changing the messianic movement, the way. He was changing that. Okay, so of course the Romans are going to assist in that. Of course Josephus is going to assist in that. Now again, some of that is speculation, but if you look at what Paul did, it's pretty obvious that he wasn't a team player with the other apostles. Okay, and that's a problem when you're a betrayer like that. When you get into an organization, befriended by the organization, and they take you in full fellowship, and then you start to cause problems, which is exactly what Paul did. He talks about the Jews in Jerusalem were so bad. So he runs to the Romans and Herod, Agrippa, he's going to do that. Well, it's because he had already violated a whole bunch of things. People recognized him from preaching the opposite to the Jamesian preaching, the way. They heard him doing this stuff on the outside and complained to James about it, who was actually the opposition high priest. So what that means is that they recognize James, who's hardly a bad Jew. We know all about it. He's called the just. He spent so much time on his knees that he had calluses on his knees. Who is the bride of Christ then? Well, you know, those who have the law of God written in their hearts and minds and have accepted the sacrifice and the atonement. Okay? It doesn't necessarily mean that you're a member of an organization. Okay? Oh, I didn't see Felicia's here? Oh, good. So that's why I talk about that a lot. And that's important, that having the law of God written in your hearts and minds. When you take the name of Jesus Christ on you, what you're saying in ancient terms is that you are going to be like him. You're going to bring his attributes into you. And what did he say? I've said this before, right? He says, he was talking about, you know, what the future would hold. And he says, greater things will you do than I have done because I go to the Father. Well, how can anybody do anything greater than do an atonement, a sacrifice? How? Because you take those attributes upon yourself and you walk, what did I say yesterday? In righteousness. You're going to make mistakes, but you walk in righteousness, okay? You promote righteousness. Hi, Felicia. How you doing? I've lost my train of thought a couple of times here, and I apologize for that. Because I'm trying to process a lot of things that I'm trying to get through pretty quickly. Any moment now, of course, you know, the internet's going to go down. Let's change the subject just one more time. Again, understand, there's a difference between the Herodians, all right, as I pointed out, and the Maccabees. So anything that's written talking about those things that I've just mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls, about things strangled, the blood, eating things sacrificed to idols, incest, niece marriage, that kind of fornication, that's all happening underneath the Herodians. Okay, now maybe for some good stuff, okay? You know, I have a very strong attachment to the Shroud of Turin. I think that it is, it obviously is. It's probably the most important, they call it a relic. But I think that God left it as kind of like the evidence, you know, because they've never been able to figure out exactly how it was made. They credit it to Da Vinci a lot, Leonardo da Vinci, but even he couldn't have performed on that thing what it does. It just wouldn't be possible. So I wanted to read a couple of things here. You notice when you look at the Shroud of Turin, at the moment of the resurrection, he's still pretty much intact. I mean, he hasn't started to decay. You know, the wounds are kind of dried out, you know, that kind of thing. And so there's been, I don't want to get into some dogma here or doctrine, but the point is he was raised in perfection. Okay? And so I wanted to read a couple of scriptures real quick and then I'll take some questions. Let's go to Acts 13:35 if you want to follow along. And a lot of this you'll know, but I just want to bring it up anyway. Acts 13:35, it says, wherefore he saith also in another psalm, which we're going to read in just a minute, thou shalt not suffer thine Holy One to see corruption. Okay? We knew that he wouldn't have any broken bones, right? And we also knew that he wouldn't suffer corruption. He's not going to lay in the sepulcher and basically, you know, decay, you know, decompose. And the Shroud of Turin proved that. Let's go to Acts 2:25 to 32. And this is what it says there. For David speaketh concerning him, I foresaw the Lord always before my face. For he is on my right hand, that I should not be moved. Therefore did my heart rejoice, and my tongue was glad. Moreover, also my flesh shall rest in hope, because thou wilt not leave my soul in hell, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption. So there we are again, showing this fascinating thing about the Shroud of Turin. So let's see, Psalm 16:10, and then we'll stop there. I was going to read something in Isaiah, but that's really kind of a little different on the subject. So Psalms 16:10, that's where they actually got the thing about, well, let thine Holy One see corruption. Psalm 16:10. So let's read that. For thou wilt not leave my soul in hell, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption. Okay, so that's a lot of times the New Testament is quoting the Old. Which brings up my final point. A lot of people want to find fault with the Tanakh, with the Old Testament. Okay? They're saying that a new covenant, Jesus did away with all that and all that. Well, let me point something out. What did Jesus preach? Does anybody know what he preached? He preached the Torah. And he quoted things out of Isaiah. Okay? And the Old Testament even brings up what? Is it not written in the book of Jasher? So it's included in the Tanakh. So Jesus was aware of that, obviously. Okay? So what I'm saying is that the New Testament was supposed to be just that, a New Testament to what God had laid out. In other words, as I've explained, the Taheb, who is probably who this Jesus character probably was. I explain that in my book, and it's also in Josephus. The Taheb in Hebrew, Taheb means restorer. And that's what Jesus was. He was giving a restoration of the covenant. Okay? So, yeah, to confirm Torah. And that's exactly what he did. So, I just wanted to cover those few basic things. There's a chance that I'll probably, let's see what this is here. Hold on. Sorry. Okay, good. I thought something else was going on there. I have some people I worry about. Okay. So that's our future too, hopefully. In some way, shape, or form, our resurrection will put us back together, okay, in one way or another. All right. I guess I'll take some questions real quick, in case you have some things you want to know about. Bob Full, you quote scripture that agrees with your ideology and negate those that contradict it. No, I don't. No. Show me one that I've negated. You can show me one I've negated. The only thing I've told you is that I don't trust Paul. And you don't need Paul at all. The only thing that Paul's really good for is there is some good historical information there. Things like where Agrippa was, who was in control of what and where, his journey to Rome, some of these historical things that occurred. That's good. But as far as his doctrine, it's not from James, and he even admits it. So, and I disregard anything that doesn't coincide with James and Jesus. I just don't do it. Because I do consider that Paul was a spy for the Romans and the Herodians, and all of his subsequent things, which I've talked ad infinitum here about, basically proves it. That's a lot. Yeah, it is a large percentage of the New Testament. That's right. The Pauline epistles, the Pauline Christianity really screwed up the Middle East and the rest of the world. Yeah, it did. Okay, and I've touched on a lot of that already, and I'm not going to go any further on it here today unless I get a specific question. The Shroud only dates to 1200. No, you're wrong. See, you need to go back and see what's happened. Okay, the dates. People have tried to disregard, to discredit it. Okay, and it's not from 1200. They have things inside the cloth that they found that were definitely from Palestine in the first century. Okay, definitely. The fact that he was pierced through this part of his wrist rather than the conventional way that he was shown through there is another proof. It was not in the 1200s. There's another thing. You're going to call up the carbon dating. Well, conveniently, when they took the piece of the cloth off to do the carbon dating, there was a fire in where the Shroud of Turin was being kept, and it singed the edges of the shroud, and so the nuns went and repaired those areas. So they sewed a new piece of cloth. They tried to use the exact same weave, and it was very close, but they sewed on new pieces. Well, guess where they took the piece for the carbon dating? Guess where they took it from? Who asked me that question? Faithful theology. Guess where they took the piece of cloth from to do the carbon dating? The replacement piece. All right. So those kinds of things are what happens. All right. Well, can I prove you wrong? No, I mean, it's like I've said before. Go start up a site, and present it, Bob. All right, you can do that. But I'm going to tell you, you're going to be, you're going to be wrestling a tiger, okay? Because I know my stuff. I know it real well, and there's no doubt. I'm not saying there aren't some good things in the Pauline epistles. There are some very good things. But you're always, especially somebody like Paul, you're always going to sell yourself to make yourself look good. You're going to say some of the good things, and then you're going to sneak in some other stuff. And he did a lot of that. Well, Paul couldn't a disciple of Messiah. Paul couldn't disregard the Old Testament. He would have been dismissed out of hand. Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, for sure. But remember, he's on the inside. He's gathering intelligence information. That's what he's doing. And then they changed the basics shortly after, or shortly before, mostly after the temple was destroyed. Right around 66, things started to get hot. And of course, the temple was destroyed in 70. Yeah, no, I'm not saying that the Catholics changed anything. I'm not saying that. No, it's the stuff that was handed down to them, okay? And they were very picky about it. They didn't want to include the Epistle of James. I've already told you about that. All right? Where's Jasher? Okay, so they didn't include things. So it's not that the Catholics changed anything. It's that they were very specific about what went in. Did some of their earlier people have a hand in this process? Maybe. Okay, maybe. Yeah, core. I like that. Either you follow Paul or Jesus and the Father. Even Paul said that, right? He said, some say that they follow Cephas, some say they follow Paul, some say they follow Apollos, but you really need to follow Jesus, and that's true. And Paul was right to say that. Okay, he was right to say that. But he also should have said that James is the guy that we need to respond to now, because James was taking charge of things. Oh, come on, Thomas Jefferson. I told about my experience that was similar to Paul's last time. I'm not going to go into that again. Okay, there's no reason for me to do that. The Shroud of Turin is held in Turin, Italy, in a chapel there. I don't think that it's been moved. I think it's in the same place. They bring it out. The shroud is now in a nitrogen-filled glass, bulletproof glass container, and I think they bring it out like 4 times a year for like a week at a time, something like that. But you know how Italy is right now. I mean, this whole ridiculous medical stuff has got everything shut down. Bob Fole, I'm not taking away from any of God's word. See, do you know Greek, Bob? Do you know Hebrew? Is the seal of God wisdom? No. Um, I can see where you're getting that, but and that's a good point. The difference between the mark of the beast and the seal of God. Um, First of all, the seal of God isn't visible. Okay, it's really not. What it is it's that change in your heart and your mind. Okay, um, and that's readily seen by the destroyers. Okay, they can see that. So wisdom might be a part of it, but I don't think that's that's not like a requirement because that's something that you gain over a period of time. No, what it is as Jesus said, the two great commandments: love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, and strength, and the second is like unto it: love thy neighbor as thyself. On these two are based all the law and the prophets. So if you're doing that, I would say that's you're well on your way, right, to having the right seal. Yeah, Paul Wood, exactly. Sandra McVoy, yes. I was thinking about calling him that the other day. Paul would have been a TV evangelist if he was around today. Yeah. And I'm not going to name any of them, but yeah, he would be that type. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Again, he's trying to take glory. He's calling the apostles that walked and talked with Jesus as being something that he is going to bully because, he's as good as they are. Well, I'm as good as any of the chiefest of the apostles. Well, all right. I mean, just things like that. And I gave you those other scriptures so that you could look at those and kind of see his mindset and where he's going. I've got to say something about this Bob Fole guy. He and these other guys that are coming on Twitter, I'm wondering if they're associated at all with that Doherty character because they may even be him because he's been trying. If you remember this Jeff Doherty guy, um, I talked about him when he wanted me to be on his show, and I agreed. But then he started playing these games that I didn't really agree and all this other baloney that he was throwing out there. And I finally said, I'm not going to do it anymore. And then he started attacking me very similar to the way a lot of these folks are that have been. So I'm wondering if they're all part of the same group. It's almost too much the same. Oh, thank you. Fly fishing. That's interesting. I didn't know that. Oh, Felicia, you're studying Jasher now. Yeah, very, very good, isn't it? Yes, very good. Very, very good. Are the red letters really Jesus's words? Well, as I've said, I've noticed some problems with a few of those. I have mentioned that. Um, I really wouldn't want to get into it right now, but there are some things that they say that Jesus said that I really question. Why? Because they don't go along with his strict adherence to the Torah. There are a couple of things, okay, and one of them would be about the tax. Okay, one of them would be about the tax. The way that was written, and I kind of explain it in my book as to how it probably would have really gone down, would be somewhat different than what he would have said in reality. So that's just an example, and there's some others. But again, if this was the situation, and I maintain that it is, then there was plenty of room for people to slightly alter the text. And the big alteration was the pacification towards Rome, towards the authorities, as Paul would say in Romans 13, which Jesus would be vehemently against. Somebody's asking me about the Scriptures Bible. Gimaniod. I'm not familiar with that. I pretty much stay in the. I use the King James kind of like to get real quick information, but inevitably I go to the Hebrew, Greek, English linear Bible. That's what I do. I go right there because I want to see it in the original language and make sure that I'm getting all of the message. So, and I don't know if that one would do that. I'm not aware of it. Yeah, Constantine was actually a very nasty dude too. He was a lot like Pilate in a lot of ways. He's written as in history like he's a good guy, and he really isn't. You find that out in looking at other places. The shroud should be destroyed. It has no significance. So you must be like the BLM. You want to go around pulling down statues and stuff that are historical, even if you don't think that the shroud has any spiritual value to you. It's a piece of history. You remember Indiana Jones? You remember that? It's one of the final scenes in the first movie, Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. He's standing on top of a little hill and he's got the bazooka and he's pointing it at the ark and he's saying, I'm going to blow it up. And the French doctor is saying, this is a piece of history. We're passing through history, but this is history. You want to destroy that? Come on. Come on. No, Paul wasn't a schizophrenic. It's like I explained. He was a Roman and Herodian tool. That's what he was, in my estimation. I mean, if you want to follow him, that's fine, but I'm not going to. I looked at him strictly for historical information. Where one of the things he said, okay, is that women are to remain silent in church. Where'd that come from? If Bob's still listening, where'd that come from, Bob? Women are to remain silent in church. A lot of wisdom would be lost if women were silent in church. Yeah, I think that's right. Seal of God is purity and love with righteousness. Yeah, the first and second commandments upon which all the rest of them are built upon. Right. They'll probably put a mask on the Jesus statue. Yeah, I'm sure it's true. Yeah, your heart's intent. That's good, Marie. Um, I'm going through here pretty fast now because we've been going for almost an hour. And I did get sidetracked a couple of times. Okay. Yeah, God, a disciple. That's true. God can use anyone, and Paul's an excellent example. But again, basing the end result of his, and I don't mean the growth of the Gentiles in the church. I'm not talking about that. Looking at what he actually did to those who trusted him, uh, that speaks volumes to me. Okay. Um, there's a question here from Sustainable Stewards. Are people Paulians or Christians? A better question would be, are people Pauline Christians or are they Jamesian Christians? That would be a better question. Uh, James would not have considered himself a Christian. That's just a current delineator that I use, calling myself a Jamesian Christian. Again, he would have considered himself a follower of the way based on Torah. Okay, that's what he would consider himself to be. He would have been for circumcision, uh, for the reasons I've talked about before. It was to remind them not to mix their seed with foreign nations and to be readily recognizable. If somebody tried to sneak off with a foreign woman, she'd know that he's an Israelite, right? So that was one of the issues with James. Pauline Christianity, he was at odds with James on the necessity of some of the purity laws. Okay, the food thing, for instance, the circumcision thing, for instance. See, so he comes in to the group saying, I want to be with you guys. God came here and told me that I needed to be with you. And then almost immediately after he gains their respect, he starts to fight them and persecute them, even to the point where he's gathering information against them and giving it to the Herodians and the Romans. All right. Okay, I think we're done for the day. Just recapping real quick. Again, there's probably an original Q document, a single document that all the synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were drawn from. We may or may not find that. There probably is one in the Quran area, because those were the people that were involved with that. So that's where Jesus actually hung out a lot when he went into the wilderness for 40 days. Well, guess what the Qumran community at Damascus was called? It was called the wilderness. Doesn't mean he was wandering around out in the middle of nowhere with no food or water. Oh, he fasted on and off for sure. But the wilderness was actually a place, and it was the Qumran community. They called themselves the wilderness. Okay, so that's another thing you don't get unless you understand what was happening in history. But it's very possible that we'll get this Q document someday if they don't want to keep it hidden. If they have found it, they're keeping it hidden because it will prove again, right? If they found it in the Dead Sea area, it will prove again that was going on during the time of James, Jesus and James, and that would really ruin it. So they already let the Dead Sea Scrolls out of the bag and caused this big problem for themselves. And again, if it hadn't been for Robert Eisenman sticking his neck out, he put his fortune out there. He took he put his reputation out there, and they attacked him mercilessly as he was trying to. Yeah, the Q gospel, a Q document, you could call it a Q gospel too. Yeah, that's fine. Um, they wanted to defame him, call him names like this other guy the other night who said he had flimsy evidence, just attacking him like that, where you wouldn't even be able to read the Dead Sea Scrolls today if it hadn't been for Robert Eisenman. He's a hero that needs to be appreciated very, 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 very much. Okay? All right. So we did that. We talked a little bit about Paul again. And we also talked about the Dead Sea Scrolls and why they had to be. Some of these things that we're talking about, those subjects I just mentioned, were definitely in the first century under the Romans and Herodians during Jesus and James' time, not during the Maccabees. Nothing like those things happened under the Maccabees, so there's no way. And then we did talk real quick about the resurrection of the Shroud of Turin, and that my Holy One will not see corruption, which is our hope for us as well. Or at least that we'll get a new one of these somehow. Okay. All right. I want to thank everybody for coming. Again, I apologize for getting sidetracked on a couple of issues. I do have that situation where the only notes I have are just real basic. And you couldn't even read them. Okay, you couldn't even read them. So it's not like I did a lot of preparation for this. I just kind of wanted to close the loop on what we did the other day and kind of throw a little curve at you about the Q document. I knew that would get a lot of people excited. So there we are. All right. Thanks everybody for coming, and we'll see you next time. Think about some questions related to the Crimson Thread if you'd like. We can talk about a lot of these other things, but I'd like to spend some time on answering questions on the book if you guys are still reading that, if you have questions about it. All right. So that's what we'll do next time. Okay. All right. Take care.